BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a tag video. It's one of those tags where it's really just a single prompt and just asks you to talk about, books in relation to that one prompt. This is the good books with bad endings tag, which originated from an Eric Carl Anderson video about talking about books with spoilt by their endings, but which Sean, the book maniac, sort of weaponised and has turned into a tag, and he tagged me directly. But I think I'm going to have a very different take on this from most of the people who Sean tagged, because I don't expect endings to be any good anyway, so it's very hard for an ending to spoil a book for me. If anything, I'm more than pleasantly surprised, or on a scale that can run through to elation, when a book actually does land its ending. That for me is the surprise. It's not that a book is spoiled by an ending, but is sort of absolutely redeemed by, or not redeemed, that's the wrong word, absolutely uplifted. I don't mean in emotional terms, but uplifted by its ending. And I have several reasons for saying this. So the first one is, one of the things that gives us the most pleasure about the book is when, after we finish the last page, it carries on working on us. We carry on thinking about it. We may wonder about what if this happens going ahead, or what if that hadn't happened in the book, or what will this character go on to do after the book? All these sorts of questions. So in that sense, good books don't ever end. They don't have endings. They just have a last page. And I don't want that to be compromised, really, by an ending that sort of gives you no room for manoeuvre in your own thoughts and imagination for a post-book life of the plot or the characters. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the standard novel of beginning, middle, end, characters who go on sort of moral or intellectual or personal journeys, they follow character arcs. I hate all of that. It's so unrepresentative of how human minds work and how human beings work. So within that schematic, having an ending is very much part of the beginning, middle, end, the sort of Aristotelian poetics. The journey, the end of the journey, the point of insight, or the point of apotheosis for the character, or the point of redemption or salvation, or whatever it is, I reject out of hand. I'm not interested in it, because to me it does not represent my life, and I think if most of us are honest, does not represent any of our lives. And to me, books have to speak to me so that I can reflect on the world and on my life. They're not about escapism. So books that have endings that fit perfectly with all that has gone before in the book doesn't make it a good ending for me, because I don't like the notion of ending, as I say. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is, a lot of authors, even within their own terms, if they are sort of seeking the beginning, middle and end, don't land endings. They don't write them very well. And I've seen it argued that part of the reason to explain this is that so much attention from the author and the editors, and maybe the publisher as well, goes on the beginning of a book, because people will pick it up in a bookshop and turn to page one and read it to see if they like it, or the sample you get in Look Inside on Amazon or other equivalents, and that therefore all the focus goes on the beginning. I reject that argument, because a writer worth their salt does the necessary work on all parts of the book. Yes, more work might go into the beginning, but that doesn't, the corollary of that is that insufficient work goes on the end. I don't buy that. But with my own sort of experience as a writer, what I feel is, what it more likely equates to is that writers haven't nailed the idea of their ending in their coming up with the idea of the book in the first place. Now, I'm a seat of the pants writer. I don't plan. I don't have sort of wall charts of character, as I think I've said already in this video, I don't have wall charts with sort of character journeys and sort of incident points where key events have to happen and conflict has to be injected at this point, because I utterly reject that as a way of writing. I much more go sort of with my intuition and an organic sense. But having said that, even writers who plan and stuff, I don't think they give sufficient thought for the whole of the book in terms of how it's going to end. Now, as I say, to my mind as a writer, that's an impossible task anyway, because I want the book to live on beyond its ending. I don't want characters to have arcs and stuff. I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about when you conceive of a book, whether you're a pantser like me or a planner, you know, a pantser will not have an idea of the middle, let alone the end. They may only start with the kernel of an idea, and as they're writing it through, that's when the whole thing develops. So it's not unrealistic that, you know, they don't land the ending. But even planners, I think, don't have necessarily the conception of the end that works, because books change as you write them. As you go through, you write them, they change, even for planners and stuff. And I think the most vulnerable part, not to change, but it, you know, how it sort of fits with the rest of it, is the ending. And as I say, I just think in the conceptualisation of an idea, from an idea to a whole completed book, the ending is the most vulnerable to not smoothly or you know, organically working into the rest of it. So I think that's more an explanation rather than, all the focus goes on the beginning, because I you know, while I recognise that a lot of focus does go on the beginning, I don't think that has to be at the expense of the ending. Okay, so those are my general thoughts about endings and why I'm really indifferent to endings and how it's very hard for an ending to spoil a book for me. So I'm slightly going against the tenor of this tag. I'm going to talk about a few books where the endings are particularly lamentable. I have to think in each case whether it actually spoiled the read for me or not, and I'll deal with that individually. But I'm actually going to talk about some examples of books where the where the ending has been landed, you know, pitch perfect by the author. But let's start with the books that don't work. So, The Vegetarian, Kang, which I love, so I can't say that the poor ending to this spoilt it, because I still gave this 5 stars. This is a book in 3 parts. Part 1 is about a young, newlywed Korean woman in a very sort of traditional family setup where they have extended family around the dinner table, but she takes a dislike to the taste and everything that's associated with meat, and sort of declares her intent to become a vegetarian. This first part is the family's reaction to that. They're very hostile, but she's sort of sticking it through. Part 2 is the extraordinary part of this novel, where she's so sort of against meat, and she regards her own body as meat. She wants to reject her own body, so she wants to somehow transmogrify into a plant, into vegetative rather than animal life. And she hooks up with her husband's brother, who's a painter, who offers to paint her whole body as a flower, but he's duplicitous because he just wants to get inside her pants, basically. And it's an extraordinary piece of writing, that second section of the 2 characters and their different sort of desires. And then we come to part 3, and you know, part 3, where do you actually demarcate the start of an ending? Because I think the whole part 3 here is absolutely redundant. Where, you know, she's basically had her breakdown after the scene with the brother, and she's sort of put to live with her sister to recuperate. And it's a very sort of low-key, quiet moment, quiet conversation between the 2 sisters, which is mainly dominated by the sister. And it added absolutely nothing to the book for me. So it was a terrible ending, but an ending that was about 1/3 of the book long, which is similar to this, Boy Swallows Universe by Trent Dalton, which is a story of family life in lower middle class Melbourne, which is dominated by sort of making money through sort of drug dealing and stuff. And it's a pretty good character study of the 2 brothers and the sort of strange cast of characters around them. You get a sense of Melbourne. But unfortunately, the end just turns into a chase scene, really. That's something out of the movies. And it's really, really unsatisfactory because the whole point of the book up to that point has been character study, scene setting, and a sense of, as I say, of Melbourne, its underlife, its underworld of drug dealers and all this sort of stuff. And that's all very, that really sort of works well, I think. And then all of that is sort of surrendered by a bog standard chase scene. So that ending, did it spoil the book for me? That's an interesting one. I might have given it 4.5, 5 stars had the ending been better than it was. And I probably did knock a star off for that ending. And the final example, which comes back also to The Vegetarian by Han Kang, at what point does the ending begin? You know, where do you define an ending? Because I loved 2/3 of this book, which is set in Second World War America, where a woman who's working in an arms factory, but what she really wants to do is become a sort of salvage diver. And because of her sex, there are all sorts of glass ceilings put in front of her by the army and by society. And it's a brilliant study of that. There's another character who's a gangster who's making money off the war. And these two characters hook up. And it transpires that her father also used to work for this gangster, but he disappeared, and obviously she felt abandoned by her father. And that's, as I say, the first 2/3 of that, I was absolutely gripped and ensconced in the story of these two characters. More in her story than the gangster story, because you've read lots of things about American gangsters, you know, from Capone onwards and stuff. But, you know, he was interesting enough, but not to the extent I was immersed in her story. And then part 3, where their stories still run through part 3, but a lot of part 3 is her father turns up in the plot again on the other side of the world. He's working his passage on a ship, and it was so unnecessary. It's so gratuitous and of no interest whatsoever. It did spoil this book for me. This was definitely a 5-star read until that last third of the book. And there's tedious stuff about this guy on board a ship and all these nautical terms. You know, when we had the deep sea diving jargon with her, I was captivated. But because this character of her father felt very unnecessary being reintroduced into the book, I wasn't interested in the jargon that surrounded him. It's kind of weird how that works. So, yeah, I guess this book was spoiled because it was on its way to a 5-star read. But that doesn't really happen very often in my reading life. But I do want to talk about some books where the ending was not only landed but elevated the book in my estimation. So this is Haruki Murakami, Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, possibly the only Murakami book I really like, although Wind Up Bird Chronicle is not as offensive as some of his other books. This is two seemingly divergent stories. There are no characters shared across them. They're in different genres. One is a sort of sci-fi fantasy and the other is a sort of hard-boiled detective fiction. And the way they are brought together in the final sort of chapters is extraordinary. I never saw it coming, and I want to reread this book to see whether the trail is laid throughout the book with sort of little breadcrumb clues, or whether it is a sort of, you know, just from out of nowhere. In the way it's tied up at the end is brilliant. So that ending totally made this book for me, because otherwise it's just two genre stories which are well enough rendered, but I'm not really into genre. But the moment their discordance is united and made harmonious, it was an extraordinary achievement. Lost Children Archive, Valeria Luiselli, which was going to be a 5-star book, you know, whatever the ending was. It's a road trip across America with a blended family, the father and his son, and the mother and her daughter. The two parents have remarried one another. But that family is breaking up. By the end of this road trip, the father and the mother will split, and that means the two children will be torn apart. And it's sort of, you know, absolutely tragic because their bond that they have formed as brother and sister. But what's so good about it is the ending, is the mechanism that Luiselli uses for the ending, because when they start off on this trip in New York, the parents pack 8 or 9 cardboard boxes of 7 of them they share, and then they give one each to each of the kids, which are empty, and they say the kids should put things from the road trip as they collect them into these boxes, and that will form the memory of the road trip, because obviously at that stage they don't know that the two halves of the family are going to split apart. And the parents in their boxes have got all things for the projects that they're both heading out towards in Arizona, to do with they're making sort of sound effect based projects on 2 different types of vanishing. One is the Apache Indian, which is the father's project, and the mother's project is on the disappeared of those who've crossed the border illegally and died in the desert. But what's brilliant is you occasionally get reference to the parents' boxes because they've got things in it, but very little is known about what's in the kids' boxes. And the ending is the unboxing of each of those 2 boxes of the kids, and what the brother had put in the sister's box, and it's so touching and so beautiful. So this was 5 stars until I read that, when it became 6 stars, because that managed to elevate a perfect book. It's an extraordinary piece of work. The Octopus Man by Jasper Gibson, which I read this year. It's a book about a schizophrenic. Unlike many people with mental conditions, he doesn't regard himself as ill, therefore he doesn't see any need to take certain drugs, because why would you need drugs if you're not ill? And several people in his life are trying to get him to attend this new drugs trial because they think it will really help his situation. And apart from being a very, very good study of schizophrenia, what it actually looks like in daily life, which is really well done here. Eventually he goes on this drugs trial, and the drug does seem to help him and stuff. But the final scene is so brilliantly set up. I mean, it's a bit hard to talk about it without spoilers, but all I will say is he invites to dinner in a restaurant his carers, his main carers, which is his sister and her husband. I think there might be somebody, I can't remember, but there's an extra chair, and he says, wait, you need to wait for, before we can get started, you need to wait for the person I've invited. And it was such a brilliant denouement. But the problem with it was that setup was fantastic, but the way it was then written, with a few lines of dialogue between the 2 sides, him and his family, that didn't really deliver. That didn't live up to the extraordinary setup that had been written. So that was a bit of a letdown. I mean, I love this book anyway. I gave it 5 stars. That set-piece ending, how it was framed and set up, was brilliant. And the fact that the dialogue, slightly underwhelmed, didn't really matter, because I got enough out of the book and enough out of that set-piece denouement that, that was sufficient. George Perec, W, or The Memory of Childhood. A bit like the Murakami, there's 2 divergent narrative streams here. And one is a fairly straight treatment of a boy who's passed around to his relatives as he's trying to outrun the Nazis during the Holocaust. And he has no real memories because he never settles in any one place, and some of the people that he's settles with end up, they die and disappear in the Holocaust. And whenever he's shown a photo, he can't, the date's written on the back, and he goes, no, that's wrong, that year isn't, can't be right, I wasn't there during that year. And all this sort of stuff, it's about memory. But then you have this second slightly strange stream where a guy who has changed his identity in the immediate post-war is tracked down by someone who has discovered the real person whose identity is stolen. Now, that real person was a child, and they died in a boating accident in the southern hemisphere. And the one unconvincing part of the book is the guy who's tracked him down says, you have to go to this place to basically make it full circle. So he travels to this island, and it's a very strange society. It seems to be set up on the rules of the Olympics, that everyone exists for Olympic competition. And it's a very strange strange way to run a society. And as you press on, it gets more and more chaotic and disordered, and the rules seem more and more arbitrary and cruel and harsh. And you realise, and I hope this isn't too big a spoiler, but you realise that this is a world created out of the imagination of the boy, the same boy in the other half of the story, as a metaphor for the Nazis and for what the reality of the Holocaust was, and how Nazi Germany, ruled with an iron fist and yet a sense of chaos. And it's just brilliantly done. I didn't see it coming, much like the Murakami. So I think when done well, the sort of two divergent story narratives and how they are knitted together, woven together in the end, a bit like the double helix of DNA, when that's done really well, you're onto a winner with an ending there. This is William Gaddis, Agape, a book written while he was in hospital, dying. He was writing it against time before he died. It was published posthumously, and the book is about a writer dying, trying to complete his work before he dies. So echoes with Gaddis's own real situation. So that sense of urgency, both in the fictive rendition but also the real life rendition, gives this ending some potency and some real sort of emotional punch. It's a great book anyway. I'm not going to go into the details of it about Gaddis's views on art versus mass commercial art, which is sort of the heart of the book. But it's, as I say, it has a real, the ending here is like the blue touch paper and Stand Back, and it very much delivers that. And finally, Dark Spring by Ulla Kazern, who was a German surrealist, painter, poet, wrote a couple of short novels, of which this is one. And this is a very dark tale of a 12-year-old girl who feels very isolated. Her dad's never around. She's always trying to fill the gap of him. And there are a couple of really unpleasant scenes in here. One when her brother sexually assaults her, and another where a dog is set upon her to, sexually molest her. And it came at a time when I'd read several novels which had human-to-dog sex, as I've mentioned before, which is really quite repulsive. But this is the only one in which it actually is there for a reason, because the ending, which again I can't really talk about without spoilers, but the concept of a dog and her, not in a sexual way this time, is absolutely on point, nails the ending, and you go, yup, that's, genius. Tragic, but genius. So there is an example again of a book that nails its landing. So yeah, I've flipped this tag on its head, because I think as I say, I don't see books being spoiled by endings. I see them as only being sort of uplifted or elevated by endings. So I hope you'll forgive me that in indulgence. Thanks to Sean and Eric. Till next time.